Well, hello again, it's Mr. Dale here, and we are now in Module 4. And the objective of this video is to talk about the grammar that we will need for Module 4. Let's take a brief look at the overview of the grammar. Remember that we're going to be talking about have to. Tengo que trabajar, I have to work, versus things that we like to do. I like to play soccer. It's not something we have to do, but it's something that we enjoy or like to do. After that, we will take a look at possessive nouns, remembering that we need that a little apostrophe after the noun to make it possessive. So Tom's house is big. My dad's car is expensive. These are examples of possessive nouns. We will take a small look again at comparing and contrasting. Remember that if we compare something, we're showing how it's the same or how it might be different. And then lastly, we will be looking at there is and there are statements. Remember that in Spanish, there is or there are would be I. You can say hay un gato en la casa. The important thing right now is there is for singular. So I'll just put singular here. It means one, right? Singular is one. There are is for plural. And plural is more than one. Greater than one, so two or more would be plural. So let's talk about this have to and like to. Here's a couple of explanations. Have to would be an obligation, something you need to do. Work, eat, sleep. These are things that we have to do. Versus things that we like to do, and we can say that is more for enjoyment. So examples that we might use in class. I have to be at work at 7 a.m. She likes to live in the country. We have to finish this project. And then in a question we might ask, where do you like to live? In the city or in the country? Remembering that this is basically a unit about country and city. So that is have to and like to. Let's move on and talk about possessive nouns. A possessive noun shows who owns something. In Spanish, if you own something, you're the dueño, I believe. So to make a possessive noun, we just add an apostrophe and an S after the noun. Here's an example. Bob's farm is big. My father's house is in the country. These are both possessive nouns. But what happens if the noun is plural? Remember, a plural noun already ends in an S. For example, keys, llaves. We know it's plural because it ends in an S, but we already know that to make a possessive noun, we need to add an apostrophe and an S. Well, in the case of a plural noun, we simply put the apostrophe after the S, okay? So, the cow's food is in the barn. We know cows is plural. We simply put the apostrophe after the S. Same way with the birds' beaks are orange. And the students' desks are clean. So if we have a plural noun with the S already there, simply put the apostrophe after the S, and we know it is a plural possessive noun. So we've talked about have to and like to in our sentences. We've already talked about possessive nouns in plural and in singular. Let's talk a little bit about compare and contrast, especially when we're talking about the country versus the city. So in class, our conversation will probably look like this. The country is better than the city. Better is actually a comparative adjective for good. We don't say gooder in English. We actually change the whole adjective and it becomes better. So if you see better, you're actually talking about good. The country is better than the city. Here's another example. The city is busier than the country. We're comparing the country and the city. Another example we might use in class, there are more cars in the city than in the country. There are fewer animals in the city, and I think it is better to live in the country than in the this should say city, sorry. All right. And the other important thing that we need to remember if we're doing comparatives is than, okay? When we're comparing, we need to include the word than. Now, there is the English word then. Okay, that is a different word. That's like the next thing. So I could say, I went to the beach, then I went home. But in comparatives, we need this form of the word than, okay? And they actually sound different. This is then, this is than. So we're not using this form, we're going to say then. Okay, so we've talked about compare and contrast. Let's move on. We're going to talk a little bit about there is and there are and how to use them correctly. Now, there is used for singular nouns, whereas there are is for plural nouns. We've talked about that. So I can say there is a cow in the barn, or there are 3 cows in the barn. Okay, there are is for plural. What we need to remember is that with negative and in questions, with the plural form, we need to use any. Let's look at an example of how that looks. I can say there is not, or there isn't, a cow in the barn. But if I am in the plural negative, I need to say there are not, or there aren't, any cows in the barn. So with plural, when we're talking about plural, so we're talking about there are, we need to use the word any after the there are, okay, or there aren't. It's the same with questions. In the singular, it's okay. Is there a cow in the barn? That's okay. But when we go to the plural, are there any cows in the barn? So when we have a plural and we are talking about negative or questions, we need to remember to use that any with it. Let's just quickly review. The objective of this video was to talk about the grammar for Module 4. We talked about things we have to do versus things we like to do. And I encourage you to practice at home some sentences that we can use in class. We talked about how to make nouns possessive by adding an apostrophe S. And if it's plural already, we simply add the apostrophe after the S. We talked about compare and contrast. We can say the country is better than the city, or you might say the city is better. One we did not talk about is bad. So if something is bad, we don't say badder, we actually say it is worse. So I can say the city is worse than the country. Okay, so both of them are fine. And then lastly, we talked about there is and there are. And there is was for singular, there are was for plural. I guess the important thing we need to remember in this was that for there are in negative and in questions, we also needed to include the word any with it in negative and in questions. So that is the grammar we will use in chapter 4.